My name is John Brumby and I'm the 8th Chancellor of La Trobe University, which I'm honoured to be, and I'm your host for this evening. Can I begin by acknowledging the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation and who are the traditional owners of the land on which we are gathered tonight, and pay my respects to elders past and present. When I left politics 8 years ago, I said that I wouldn't be a political commentator, and I haven't been over that period, and I won't be tonight. I'll be keeping my promise. So my role is simply to introduce our outstanding panel of political and media experts. So on the panel tonight, we are joined by, in the middle, Cathy McGowan. Cathy, of course, retiring independent MP, social media campaigner, stood as an independent candidate in the 2013 election for the federal seat of Indi, won that and was re-elected in 2016. Cathy was born and raised in regional Victoria, began her working life as a teacher in Nil and Wangaratta. Her community service, extensive community service over a long period of time, has been acknowledged with an Order of Australia, a National Centenary Medal and the awarding of a Churchill Fellowship. So welcome to Cathy. On the far left there, I don't know if that's an accurate depiction of Andrea's political views or not. Andrea is a political scientist from La Trobe University, of course. Andrea has authored numerous articles on Australian politics, election campaigns and digital media. Her most recent co-authored book is Australian Politics in the 21st Century, Old Institutions and New Challenges, and she has a new book coming out shortly, which I don't think I'm allowed to reveal. She was awarded Australian Research Council funding until 2021 as part of a team using big data to understand the media's role in political debate and policy decisions. Karen Middleton, to Andrea's right. Karen is a press gallery veteran. You become a veteran.
The V word.
It's the V word. But I was actually in the federal parliament in the 1980s and the old Parliament House, and Karen started there in 1987. So she's now the chief political correspondent for the Saturday paper. So she's got more than 3 decades of experience reporting on national and international affairs for the Australian media. Previously chief political correspondent for SBS Television. She's worked in the Federal Parliamentary Press Gallery and she served as its president for 4 years. And finally, to Ali's left, Nasha Bayan. Nasha is a media expert, again from La Trobe University. She worked as a journalist for 15 years at public broadcaster SBS and the ABC. Her commentary on sport and diversity has been published in The Age, in the New Daily, in the Jakarta Globe and in the Straits Times. She's also produced hour-long documentaries for ABC Radio National and Grandstand Digital. When Nasha isn't working on a book about sport and social inclusion or acting as an AFL multicultural ambassador, she plays indoor soccer and learns K-pop dance routines, whatever they are. If we lack a bit of excitement later on, maybe, I don't know, K-pop. Now, the discussion tonight, we are very, very fortunate tonight and delighted, of course, that tonight is going to be facilitated by respected and, we're allowed to say veteran journalist. I think we are for you as well. I don't know if that's I think it's a positive word. It is a very positive word. And broadcaster Ali Moore, who many of you will have seen on TV and heard on radio. We're delighted to have Ali with us tonight. So, Ali, that's my bit, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Chancellor. I should say that both myself and Karen started work when we were about 2. That's what gives us the veteran category. I'm really glad that we are having this conversation this week and not last week, because with all the public holidays, there was a real lack of momentum and it was very difficult, I think, to establish just what this election campaign was looking like. But at least now that we've got the start of the pre-polling, we've had the first leaders debate, we've had some really big ticket spending announcements, it is starting to look like the election campaign that we might have expected. And Annabelle Crabb put it really well earlier this week when she wrote, "The gloves are off, the pedals hitting the metal, and the ferrets off the leash." This election also has the highest enrolment rate in Australian history, 96.8%, and also a record enrolment rate for young Australians at 88.8%. So you'd really hope that that would translate to a pretty high level of engagement, and whether it has so far is one of the questions that we will talk about tonight. You, of course, are already engaged, which is why you're here. Kathy and the other members of the panel are really keen to know a bit about you. So if I can just ask any members of the audience who have come from regional areas, who represent regional areas tonight. Very good. Doesn't mean you get first dibs on questions, but still. And how many students in the audience? Okay, that gives you a little bit of an idea of who you're talking to tonight. And you will get a chance, of course, a little bit later in the discussion to join the conversation. And if you'd like to share it with your friends, please do feel free to do that and use the hashtag BoldLTU. I thought a good place to start, given how this campaign sort of dribbled along for a bit and now seems to have hit its stride, was to ask for big picture impressions of the campaign so far. So Karen, if I can start with you, how would you characterise this election so far?
Oh, I think it's gone the full grubby in the last couple of days, which is not that surprising really, because there's a lot at stake. There's a lot at stake for the government because they're looking down the barrel of defeat, if you believe the opinion polls. But there's also a lot at stake for Bill Shorten. In fact, I think I said on Insiders on the weekend that there's more at stake for him almost than Scott Morrison. Scott Morrison's been in his job for 8 months and Bill Shorten's been in his for 6 years. And if he loses this election, there will be hell to pay in the Labor Party. So, it's a high pressure environment for both sides. And I think for the nation, there's a lot of issues people care deeply about. There are questions over the economy and the future of that. There are always questions about national security. And I think people are engaged. The social media environment is quite febrile. And so there's a lot of attention being paid. And I do think as we come into this last fortnight, it's the sort of danger zone for both sides. And that's why when I say we've gone the full grubby, I mean, in the last sort of 24 hours, the dirt units have started to work very hard and you're starting to find the stuff in people's, from social media posts from 5 years ago and that kind of thing. And that's deliberate. They leave those things until late in the campaign to reveal because the candidates are already registered and nominated and on the ballot.
And they stay there.
And they stay there, so there's no chance to replace them. So you're summarily sort of dismissing one by one candidates who will remain on the ballot paper, and that's kind of a blow for whichever party. And we've seen, 3 disendorsed in the last 24 hours and some pressure on 2 others, one from Labor and one from the Liberals today.
And it is, what's really interesting though, is it raises fascinating questions about the level of due diligence done, because a lot of this stuff is not that hard to find, and we will return to that in a minute. But Andrea, what about you? How would you characterise the campaign? And do you think people are now starting to engage?
Yeah, I think this week is the week that people are really starting to switch on, and part of that is because, of course, early voting opened on the 29th on Monday, and the first debate was that night as well, which wasn't by coincidence. But I think really we've seen the permanent campaign in play since Scott Morrison came in as Prime Minister back in September. The bus going around in January, I think, around the top states, particularly around Queensland. But none of us were all that attuned to it, I think, apart from those who have to be, who are paid to be, because we're having Christmas and we're having January holidays. And this has been an odd campaign because it's been punctuated by Easter holidays. And the news headlines have also been very scattered compared to what they were in 2016. For example, I think Winx got a lot more headlines in the first week, the racehorse that won, 18 in a row, than what the candidates did on the front pages. And then with the tragedy of the Sri Lankan bombings over Easter, there's been lots of distractions going on, but social media has certainly ramped up. I think I counted there's been 3,500 paid ads between the 2 major parties since the official 5 weeks of the campaign.
And that's on social media alone?
That's on Facebook. That's not to mention the other platforms of Twitter and Instagram. And as Karen said, it's starting to get quite grabby. I think we'll start seeing messaging around the real core areas for the 2 major parties a lot more than we have for the coalition. Typically, that's the economy and trying to frame as much as they can asylum seekers as national security. And for Labor, it's typically health and education. But I think also there's a real opportunity for Labor to start ramping up the gender questions. We've got a record number of female candidates in this election, and the lead up to Turnbull being ousted from office was the consternation by the low level of participation and representation on the Liberal Party of Women, and high-profile women like Julia, Banks, Julie, and also Julie Bishop, coming out and speaking about the way that women are treated in the Liberal Party. So I think there's an opportunity there once the gloves are off to really make this a gender campaign.
Nasha, what about you, and particularly from the perspective of younger people, given that, as we said, we have this record enrolment rate for young Australians?
I can't think of a time where I've changed my view of the supposed apathy of young people so quickly. The last time I spoke to you about this, Ali, I christened this particular campaign the campaign of MEH, M-E-H, because I thought that off-the-cuff conversations with my students indicated that they had had it up to here with politics.
This was less than a week ago, this conversation.
Yeah. And since then, the news has come out that we've had the highest number of young people enrolling, which I think is an absolutely positive sign.
A lot of that flows through, though, from the marriage equality.
Yes,
vote.
Flowing on from the marriage equality vote. But also, I was quite impressed that young people are actually trying to engage in. I mean, one of the conversations that I sort of eavesdropped on in my class was between an international student who was British, and he was saying that he actually thinks it's a fantastic thing that we're made to vote. So young people, have to enrol, otherwise, and they have to vote, otherwise they're fined.
But they don't have to care. Do they care?
That's the big question. They are enrolled to vote. They're presumably they're about to participate, but we don't know what they're going to put on the ballot papers, and that's something that I guess is a big question mark. I've come off a lot of commentating and writing about elections that happen in Indonesia, where I was born, and there's demonstrable apathy there among young people, and almost a comical approach to the election. They're sort of really disillusioned with the whole political process. It would be interesting to see what comes out from this really high record levels of young people's voter registration, whether or not that translates to them actually playing an active role in citizenship.
We should just briefly mention the Indonesian election, which is amazing and makes this look so piddly, doesn't it? 245,000 candidates for 20,000 positions voted on in a single day, which is incredibly impressive. Do you think the parties, though, in Australia are focused on that younger vote? I mean, it seems to me we're not seeing a lot of specific policy focus that will get the new voters. I've got a couple of daughters, both of whom are new voters, and there's nothing that's engaging them.
I totally agree. I think it is, we've previously spoken about big picture sort of issues. So the general issues that I guess people should theoretically care about irrespective of their age. So climate change, jobs, infrastructure, nothing that specifically targets the young person's vote. And again, I hate to draw the contrast between quite a new democracy in Indonesia, but we did see candidates in Indonesia trying to target young people specifically. Whereas I haven't really seen a lot of that here. And I don't know whether it's because the pressures on young people are slowly merging to become the same pressures that their parents are facing in terms of rising costs of living, infrastructure, climate change, those sorts of issues perhaps are sort of melding into, sort of the same things that their parents are facing.
Kathy, when I spoke to you earlier, you did make the point that really the big picture is not what you're looking at because your head is so immersed in Indi. Tell us about the campaign from the Indi perspective.
So you do have to excuse me, we've been campaigning now, pre-polling. So as the retiring Member of Parliament, my job is to get Helen Haynes re-elected so that we keep the seat orange, keep it independent. So we have been working to do that. And I say we, there's 1,600 people who have signed up to volunteer. We've got rosters running around the whole electorate. We've got 14 community hubs that are being staffed in all of our country towns to get the grassroots support that we need. So it really is head down, bum up. But the thing that I wanted to add to the contribution is that you say grubby, the thing that we've seen in Indi, which is a marginal electorate, the National Party and the Liberal Party are both running against the independent, so that we've sort of got three. The level of pork barrelling is something that I have never witnessed before. Well, we've never been a marginal seat, so we've never had it, I suppose. But
So you didn't see it in 2016?
no, we didn't. No, and certainly not like this. So the Liberal Party candidate did a tour of the electorate and spoke to people, and now he's going around and saying, well, I've spoken to people, so I'm going to put $250,000 into a Scouts Hall. And you wonder, well, what's that got to do with Commonwealth funding a Scouts Hall? But he said, no, I've spoken to the people in this town and that's what we're going to do. And the people in the town go, what? Like, who said that was an urgent? Who said that was needy? And could we have some money for the hospital, please? So I'm going to be fascinated to see how this plays out, because there's the lack of process around government money, and because we never get money. Like that's probably why I got elected, because we're a safe seat for so long, and so no infrastructure came our way. We've just forgotten that the candidate saying, well, if you vote for me, these are election promises, but you have to vote for a Liberal to get these. Like, it's so bland, so not bland, so blatant. So that's the level of grassroots that we're at. And it's just like talking to people and saying, well, you've actually got a choice about this. You can vote that way, and the dominant paradigm will go that way, or you've actually got this really good independent candidate who's not like that. So make a choice here. But the challenge is how do you get that level of discussion? You can say at a national level it's horrible stuff happening and people don't like it. But at the grassroots, how do you actually engage with our young people to say, well, your vote is actually going to really matter here, and you have to make a choice, and you can make a choice, and how you vote will have a fundamental impact on what happens in our community, and dare I say for the nation, because the other bit of why I love the conversation about the local impacting on the whole. So for those who get a bit of geography, I'm northeast Victoria, which coming up the Hume Highways, Wodonga, Wangaratta and Benalla and Mansfield. But just across the Murray River in Albury, there's another independent candidate running against a Liberal Party a member
That's
of Parliament.
Susan Lee in Farrer, isn't it? And running against the mayor.
So she's been there for 20 years. And the community have looked across the border and seen what happened in Victoria and said, well, we want more of that. So I just have this wake up on the 19th, and there's a map of Australia, and with a little bit of luck, there'll be, well, not luck, because it's huge hard work, but there'll be this glowing heart of orange out of Albury Wodonga of a community that actually claimed the agenda back. Totally different candidates, mind you, but actually claimed back the power. And if we can pull that off, to say to the rest of Australia, you don't have to put up with this. That if a little community like Northeast Victoria can actually claim back the agenda, then communities right around Australia can do it. And I know that it is happening. You know, I get emails from Mallee and people saying, we're running, we're inspired, what can you teach us? And I know up in Sydney as well, people are trying to do the same thing. So I suppose that's what I'm seeing, and it's young people just leading the charge. They're turning up. They're saying it's a climate change election. We really want a better Australia.
But Cathy, let me ask you this, because there's a couple of interesting things about Indo. One of them was you won against Sophie Mirabella, who people largely felt had forgone their local area for a sort of national profile. Then they put her up again in 2016. And it's never happened in Australia that one independent has been followed by another independent in a federal seat. So that, the challenge is really on. But how do you convince people that if it's about representation, the independent is the best person to represent the local issues, especially when you've got a Liberal candidate saying, vote for me and I'll give you this and I'll give you that. And if I'm in government, I can do that. If you're an independent, you can't do that unless you can make a deal. And you don't make deals.
I don't know about that.
No, but I can't.
That's what she's told me.
Well, the Fin Review on Tuesday ran an article, page 11, basically saying that Indi is the most pork-barrelled electorate in the whole of Australia for infrastructure. Like, not something you want to be proud of, but fact. So there's an assumption that you only get things by being in government, and it's so wrong. You get things by being very clever and very strategic, and Indi has demonstrated like $500 million worth of money has come in. So we've got things, but the other thing that we've got, that the community now has, is confidence. And you absolutely need confidence if you're going to grow jobs, if you're going to grow development, if you're going to be a place people want to live in. So Indi is now significantly more confident, and it's engaged. So when people say, well, what has an independent ever done? I say, well, we've got an engaged community. They turn up in their 250 people at the Benalla Forum. There's a Victorian Farmers Federation forum tonight, and there'll be hundreds of people at that. People are engaged. They know their vote counts. So surely that's one of the biggest gifts you can give your community. But it's not just, the question is, how do you do it? And let me say, it's incredibly difficult to convince people that they've actually got a choice, and the choice is in their vote, when there is such distrust of the system. There's such distrust of, I'm going to say Liberal and Labor, Liberal and National Party in particular, but it does extend a bit wider, but Labor's never been a strong contender. So the level of distrust is something that me and Helen Haines and others have got to go and say to people, well, that's how it used to be. That's all last century, and we got rid of Sophie. Let's see what we can actually do now, not from a negative place, but let's see from a positive place what an engaged community can do to be the change you want to see. So that's really the offer. And in a way, I say to my community, of course we want to win this election, but even if we lose, we haven't lost, because we've got these 1,600 volunteers, and we've got these engaged people who now know what they want. And I actually say to the National Party and the Liberal Party, gosh guys, you actually don't want to win this, because if you do, you are going to have to jump up in your representation from being very poor to being very good. And you're going to have a community that's engaged and going to watch every single thing you say. So you're actually going to have to work.
I want to look at the issue of independence actually more generally in the election, but we'll return to that in a minute. Bouncing off that sort of regional focus, Karen, when you look at this election, do you see it as less national than previous elections? That it is, and I'm thinking in big picture, I mean, the really obvious one is Adani in Queensland versus Adani in Victoria, but there are lots of, it seems, focus issues that only connect to particular areas.
Yeah, I mean, I think we often say, oh, there's 151 different elections, and that's true, and it's always true, but I think it's particularly true that it feels like that the parties are actually deliberately running very, very localised campaigns. I mean, Kathy gave the example about the Scout Hall, and I've been looking at that today, you know, the Scout Halls and the tennis and football clubs and all the money that's being pumped in locally. And I think people are a bit cynical about that, to be honest, but there are very, very localised campaigns because, you know, if the swing is on nationally, well, the government is gone, but it hopes it can retrieve seat by seat. You know, it's running a ground war. It hopes it can retrieve seat by seat and just hold off, pick particular seats and do some mathematics and maybe save itself. I think it's pretty tough. The mathematics is very tough, but it really is this strangely disjointed, very, very localised campaign. And partly I think that going back to the comment about Facebook and ads and things like that, the advertising can be so much more targeted now online. It's cheap, and they can target you really individually. So the local stuff is quite effective in that respect, because your Facebook feed will show you advertisements about, you know, your demographic, your local area, and that, I think that serves to also really localise the campaign. So you've got these national themes, you've got the sort of fairness thing versus strength in the economy, those big themes, and they'll continue to be rolled out, but you've also got all this activity at the local level and a lot of grenade throwing. Gee, I'm using a lot of war, analogies here, but, you know, there's a lot of that going on at the ground level.
Andrew, tell us a little bit about the effectiveness of those sorts of ads. I don't know, I mean, I actually just yesterday got yet another text message from Clive Palmer, which I no longer even read.
Watch my launch live stream.
Yeah, exactly.
Thank you, but no.
And I wonder how many people are like me and like, really, or if it's on your social media feed, you don't mind it. I mean, what's the?
Well, we've got an expert amongst us, actually. Cathy McGowan ran an incredibly effective social media campaign back in 2016, which I'm sure Cathy can speak to in a moment. But the beauty of social media is you've got your paid ads, which we've spoken about, but you also have the free content just pushing out messages. And if you are prepared to share that message with a friend, that peer-to-peer network is really powerful. If I get messages from my friends in my Twitter feed or Facebook feed, then that just lifts it up that one level more than if it was coming from someone random. So it can have quite an effect there, as well as the targeting aspect with the paid ads, and it is cheap, and it is a way of being able to get messages out. Mind you, some of our politicians are much better at doing it than others, and it's often said that Australia is probably an election cycle behind what's going on in the United States, and social media really kicked off probably 2008 with Barack Obama, off the back of 2004, where they really began to start using network analysis, and then 2012 is where Barack Obama was able to really fundraise and get micropayments from supporters to be able to generate that very large campaign. And the Labor Party's been very astute at being able to pick up on how that campaigning's worked by sending teams over to watch and to participate in the US elections, and to be able to copy some of the playbook, not just with social media, but also field campaigning, which Cathy's also just spoken about. Getting 1,600 volunteers in the seat of Indi is amazing. But I think one of the great examples of that also, again, was the Labor Party in 2014 in the Victorian election, amassing, I think it was about 5,000 volunteers, piecing together a war map of what the marginals were, renting houses in those seats and going around and just door knocking and phone banking and having, again, that face-to-face contact and doing it through the art of storytelling, which is another thing that social media allows you to do, and meeting people face-to-face. When you talk to someone and they say what issues are important to you and you participate, you're already going to start remembering who that person's name is and their face. So when you come to the ballot, you think, oh, I know who that person is, and they sounded interested in what I was doing, and I don't think we should underestimate those methods.
Nasha, the storytelling, as Andrea just pointed out, is really important, but does there have to be more than just an ad there? I mean, I've watched some of the feeds of particularly the leaders, and
Dorky.
you know, it's beyond dorky. It's just really boring. Oh, I managed a game of ping pong today, and
Ali,
look
are you
who
a
I
little
met.
cynical?
Am I too cynical? I don't know. But I mean, what engages people, do you think?
Social media is a very, very strange beast, and we saw that Facebook understood that people tended to engage more with the sorts of things that Andrea is speaking about, that is, personal posts from their friends. And this is one of the reasons, I think, behind, I guess, the axing of so many jobs from places like BuzzFeed, places that had built up social media followings and audiences through the spread of their news going viral. So a lot of these publishers were just, they were completely screwed when Facebook changed its algorithm so that in our news feeds we would see more personal posts, so more posts from friends. And I agree with Andrea, we do tend to pay more attention when something has been recommended to us or posted about by a particular friend. But, it's something that we have to be really wary about because they're constantly changing these algorithms. The last I heard is that Instagram is now trying to gauge engagement by hiding people's like counts. So people who act as social influencers, they like the number of likes that they see on Instagram. They're trialling this among a user base in Canada so that your posts, other people cannot see how many likes you get.
So you have to make up your own mind and not just go with what everyone,
else is doing. That's exactly right. And Twitter is thinking about this. So Instagram has rolled out these trials. Twitter is thinking about it, and Facebook has already screwed around a couple of publishers by pushing personal engagement to the forefront. So I do think that people will be engaged more if it's somebody they know or somebody they trust. Perhaps maybe somebody they don't even like all that much, but they'll pay more attention to those types of posts.
Cathy, what worked for you? As Andrea said, very successful social media campaign in 2016.
A little story here. One of the things that worked most was our young people, because they got it, and us older people stopping trying to control it. So we worked with the young people. And this actually was 2013. There was just this most phenomenal use of Tumblr, and it was called Cats for Cathy. And it was just...
What is it about cats? I mean,
Yeah.
There's a lot of
And-
cats on Tumblr.
Yeah, and it was the puns were on the cats. You know, if you don't vote for Kathy, it'll be catastrophic, and a photo or whatever. Look, it's still up there on Tumblr, and it's worth having a look at. But it was that quirky sense that I would have said no to. We're not going to do that. But the young people said, well, you just stick out of this. It's none of your business. We know how to do it, and letting them do it, and just giving them the power to do it among their networks what they needed to do. But the really important thing that made it different for us was that in Indi, we knew that the future of the whole world belongs to those young people. And they had a much greater interest in the outcome of that election than I did. I mean, I cared, but they really, and they still do, really, really care. So they're actually going to do the work. And if you trust them, which we did, because they wanted an outcome that was better for them, then they not only did the work, but used all the skills they have around that being digital natives in a way that us older generation, us veterans, we could never even thought of. So there was such a lesson about that engaging and giving young people confidence that they know how to do it, just go and do it.
In a way that's not cringy.
Yeah,
Oh,
not
no,
cringy.
nothing cringy.
And is it? I find this fascinating. For example, in India, Modi is a massive user of social media, huge, but it's largely one way. He does not engage. He puts his message out. That's it.
Yeah, I got a direct message on Twitter from him at one point. I was like, the Prime Minister of India, you know, and yeah. but
That's
it was-
interesting.
Did you respond?
Yeah, no.
Well, he wouldn't have responded
I
back.
wasn't sure that it would go to the top of his, you know,
Yeah.
list
But
of
I find
priorities.
that fascinating. Is it an engagement tool or not really?
Well, for us it is. So, yeah, it's huge. And the hours that I would need to put in and my staff would be putting in to social media were huge. So, for example, in an average, this is as a Member of Parliament, in an average year, we would get, I've got 100,000 people in the electorate, and we would have 15,000 engagements with my constituents. And most of those, I'd say about 3 would be letters, then the bulk would be emails, and then there'd be all the social media stuff that comes in, because that was the way people worked. So we had to manage all of that in the staff, because an inquiry about NDIS that came through social media was exactly the same to the person sending it as if they'd, you know, called into the office. So it was absolutely engagement. And we took every one of those, well, I shouldn't say every one, because if I made a speech in Parliament and we put it out on Facebook and it was controversial, then you'd get the to and fro, and I would perhaps put one comment back in for the whole lot. But that was enough, because then people were all talking to each other. So you, as a Member of Parliament, you didn't have to engage in the conversation just as long as they knew you were listening. But, you know, we would get pages and pages of Facebook comment if I was doing something controversial. But that was fantastic for me, because it let me know really direct feedback on how I was going in terms of representing my community.
So that's an exemplar way of using social media, and Australian politicians, particularly with the major parties, tend to still use it as a broadcast medium, pushing messages out, not engaging in conversation. Politicians that use social media really effectively are former politicians like Jackie Lambie. Pauline Hanson does very well with social media, and it's because she talks to her constituents constantly. And she puts out lots of videos. Every event she goes to, she'll do a selfie or some sort of short little video, or her staff will. I'm not sure how often it's her. But people want the engagement. They don't want the broadcast. And that's what gets the traction.
Karen, you talked about the grubbiness at the beginning, but you've increasingly in the last couple of weeks, a number of journos have talked about just how feral social media has become. More feral than usual, which is quite possibly saying something.
Yeah.
What is that about?
Well, there is the engagement thing, and there's a demand for engagement. So if you're talking about Twitter, which is where I would mostly engage on politics with people, there's high expectations of journalists in this environment. There are very partisan constituencies, and I don't necessarily mean partisan in the party political sense. I just mean, you know, ideological, and they're very engaged, and everything that you post is seen through the prism of somebody's political point of view, and the responses are just more aggressive than usual. at
Very
the moment.
aggressive
Yeah,
in
they
some
are.
cases.
Quite aggressive at the moment, yeah.
But is that reflecting a broader underlying theme of not feeling that, that the electorate not feeling they're being listened to, or this portion of the electorate?
Yeah, I think there's the disillusionment about not having been well represented, and the major party system and the whole system in general. And so media, old media, us, are seen as part of that problem. And I think so I think there's a degree of that, and so you're just copying kind of a blast from people. And social media in that form empowers people because they have an individual voice and they can talk to you directly and you talk back to them. And so that just emboldens people to engage more. But there's also, at this point in an electoral cycle, people set up accounts, partisan people, political partisans set up fake accounts and bombard you. And so it's always worth having a look at, the anonymous.
How long the
They're
account's
always
been there?
anonymous. How long it's been there, how many people? Oh, 0. There was one at one point that was hammering me. This was some time ago, years ago now, and I had a look and I was the only person that it followed. I thought, okay, well, that's somebody who really hates me, like particularly me. But it does, it is worth having a look at that stuff because you can then see, oh yeah, actually this is a campaign. This is not a genuine, someone with a genuine beef. It's someone who's out with another agenda.
And you just brought up then traditional media. I mean, we're talking about social media a lot, but how do you see it? How do you see the impact of traditional media on this campaign? And in some ways, it seems almost, you can't separate them because one so feeds the other. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I just think more and more, the more social media dominates, the more the old style of campaigning with traditional media looks sort of weird and crazy. I'm, for my sins, going out on the campaign trail next week briefly, and haven't done that for some time because as a television correspondent, mostly you don't, as a senior TV correspondent, because managing the volume of incoming material, video material that you have to put your eyeballs across every day from 2 campaigns and then wherever else it's happening is just so time consuming you actually can't do it when you're physically on the move. So you tend not to do it. So it'll be interesting to see from, just for a personal perspective, how much it's changed. But you are so captured in that environment, whoever you're with in terms of the 2 party leaders, you're on their bus, you're driven around by them, they book your hotels, they don't tell you where you're even going. We used to joke about it. I think it peaked in 2004 and we were actually in the air at one point, not knowing where we were heading. We're looking out the window. Are we going north or south? I mean, it was, and we were going to Tasmania and it was when the forestry thing happened. But, it does get totally ridiculous. So that there are frustrations from people in traditional media that they actually they're thwarted from doing the job they feel like they need to do. And so there's this other thing going on in social media, and those people in traditional media are engaging in that as well and trying to make a contribution through social media. So, I mean, I look at Twitter as another avenue for my journalism, and then you've got to be very careful about when you're engaging in a personal sense and when you're engaging in a professional sense, and it's always professional in a sense, but you've got to be careful about that, and the people who are reading what you're writing are probably not seeing the distinction, and that's what you have to be very careful about.
Natasha, how do you see it? I mean, where do you see it as being, what's more important, do you think?
I think there's a perceived distrust of the mainstream or of traditional media. Now, the level of that distrust, I think, differs according to national context. So it's definitely there in Australia, but it's there probably tenfold in the United States, and that's something that Trump has sort of taken and ran with. And he said, everything's fake news, CNN is fake news, it's all fake news, but here I am, and, to those people who would vote for me, you can speak to me directly, I can speak to you without these lying bastards, who'll misconstrue everything that I say. There's a slight distrust of the media here, but I think people still understand that. I mean, I'm not going to listen to my mechanic friend espouse like who's a better economic manager for the country. I think there is still a role and there is still a place for mainstream media, certainly to digest and to. It sounds like I'm sort of being the grumpy old fart compared to my students, but I long for the days when budget information, for instance, didn't come out 160 characters at a time. I want somebody to sort of unpack that for me, and say, this is what this actually means. I think there is still a need for that.
And in fact, interesting, just talking about fake news, we have had fake news in this campaign. I mean, Andrea, I think the best example is the Labor
Death
Party
tax.
death taxes, death duties.
Yeah, that's right.
Is this, how big an issue is this in Australia? We talk about fake news all the time, but in reality, how big is it?
Well, it's interesting. We did a study when I was at the University of Melbourne with a couple of colleagues there, where we looked after, at the 6-month period after Trump was elected, whether there was a contagion effect going on in Australia, whether politicians were using the terminology of fake news as Nasha just described, the way that Trump does. And what we found was that the good news is not many people do use fake news language in the 6-month period that we looked at. And we looked across different forums, across the Hansard, how they use it in Parliament, how they use it in mainstream media, how they use it at doorstops, how they might use it on social media feeds, and how they use it in their press releases. And what we did find is something that is an international trend, and that is it's mainly parties on the conservative side of politics that tend to use fake news terminology. And it's two types of politicians. It's those that get no airplay, or are minor politicians, and so they're doing it to try and cut through and get amplify their messages. And so Malcolm Roberts was a culprit at the time, which probably doesn't surprise anyone. And then it's politicians who already get a lot of media attention, who are able to use fake news to delegitimise the media, primarily the media. So we're looking to see whether they were attacking the media or their rival politicians, and it was mainly the media. But the lesson for us in looking at this was that mainstream media didn't push back. They didn't refute when something was falsely categorised as being fake news when indeed it wasn't. They let it go through. And so I think that's where the challenge comes for mainstream media to call it out.
Yeah, in fact, there's a really interesting article, which you pointed me to on The Conversation, that Dennis Muller wrote, that where he makes the point that you get all this outlandish stuff, you get the fake news, someone comments on it, then that becomes part of the mainstream media reporting, and it's all this, and that someone has to break that cycle.
So the death tax incident, which I spoke to Facebook about this today, there was rumours going around that Labor was going to introduce death tax. Labor have denied that, and it has been picked up in individuals' accounts, not on pages, organised pages, but on people sharing it amongst themselves. And Facebook has the dilemma of whether it shuts down individuals' accounts where they're sharing it, rather than organised accounts. And it's probably very heavy-handed if you've got a multinational company like Facebook coming in and saying, I think you've gone a step too far, you can't have that political commentary, even though it might be false information. And so that's a dilemma that's at play at the moment. But I think the reporting around this has been the mainstream media reporting has been pretty responsible to be able to show there's no basis to think that there's going to be a death duties tax introduced.
So what you look into this area a lot, what do you think they should do? What's the right thing for Facebook to do?
Oh, well, this is the big question, isn't it? And I think countries around the world are grappling with how do you maintain your civil liberties and freedom of speech, but at the same time have responsibility? And we saw with the Christchurch massacre that it clearly swung into some uncharted territory, which is not how we want our society to be. And there needs to be some sort of regulation around that. But you don't want to over-regulate like Indonesia has done and some other countries where for political purpose things get classified as fake news and get pulled off the site because it's politically inconvenient. So, that's what authoritarianism stems from. And when you look at reports like Freedom House, the last 13 years, media freedom has declined, and that is in liberal states as well as illiberal states. So we need to be really careful, particularly as policymakers and parliamentarians, about how we address this question rather than just putting it into the category that all social media is bad. An example of how it works well is you look at youth participation in this election, the registration. Facebook was working with the Australian Electoral Commission to make sure that buttons were put in the front of everyone's feed to get them to register to be on the electoral roll, and they got the highest ever click-through rate they've ever had on a campaign in the world on that campaign.
That's a great story.
So
that's a good news story for Facebook.
That's a positive side, but there's also this sinister stuff that it has.
Yeah. Kathy, fake news in Indo?
Well, it's not so much fake news, it's like truth in advertising. So Malcolm Turnbull and I share a sense about this, you don't have to tell the truth in political advertising. And you've got no comeback if someone tells a lie. So, for example, this went to all the letterboxes in my electorate. It says, vote for an independent and you'll get Labor higher taxes. Now, the really interesting thing about this went to every single letterbox in my electorate.
There's a very similar one in Kooyong I saw the other day too.
But the only independent Indi's ever had is me, and I voted to keep the government in control, the Liberal Party, let me say. So everybody in my community knows that I'm single-handedly responsible for them staying there 3 years. They send out something like this that's saying if you vote for an independent, you're going to get Labor, which is just so blatantly untrue in Indi. And it has caused such a reaction. People are really cross about it. And if anyone here is from the Liberal Party headquarters, pass back the message. You've done yourself a huge disservice because not only don't people believe it, they're cross about it, but should it come to pass, as the media is currently saying, that the numbers are going to be really close, what do you think a candidate who got this in their letterbox and they're going to make a choice between will they support Liberal or will they support Labor, you're going to be really less inclined to go with, and I'm not putting that out there, Helen Haines will do whatever she wants to do, but I just want to go to my friends in the Liberal Party and say, guys, you have really overstepped the mark with this. One, it's not true, and the second thing is it's really stupid if you think you're going to win people's votes on that level of scare tactic. Anyhow, there was that one, and then vote independent and you'll get the bill, like really crappy stuff. So,
Can I ask you though, it's also interesting that just in the last, I think it was yesterday, it was announced Helen Haines and a number of other independents, I think 7 in total, have signed this agreement that they're calling it the price of power, which is what they'll be looking for from the major parties, including not supporting Adani and doing more on climate change. I found that quite interesting. I thought the whole point of being an independent was to be independent, but now they've sort of put themselves in this grouping.
So yeah, I also thought it was an interesting thing to do.
Would you have done it?
No, but that was because I really prize my independence. But I think when I and Helen's running her own campaign, she will do her own thing. But the thing that each of those independents have in common is that they've gone out to the community and said they've already said that independently, like it's a climate change election. We don't support Adani and we support renewables. So I think the interesting thing was that had already been out there. So a coalition around which people have already said things in common. I think, well, that's clever. It's not that they're giving up their independence. But the way we used to work as the crossbench is we would try to find the things that we had in common. So from Clive Palmer and Andrew Wilkie, Adam Bant, Cathy McGowan, whoever else it might have been, not so much looking at where we had difference, but if you can find what you've got in common, then you can actually do your work. So it's finding that stuff in common. So when I saw that work, and I thought, well, that's a message to the rest of Australia, and if we could say to the main parties that in these 7 electorates, these people think, and they're people who want to be the representatives, think climate change is of such an issue that they're prepared to do it. I don't think there would be many other topics that they would have come together around. But I get a sense that certainly in Victoria and southern New South Wales, and given the horrific summer we've had, that climate change is just, and we've just got not only the dry summer, but that extreme in weather. Like there's flash flooding in Wodonga as I came here tonight. Like torrential rain has come down. So that extremes of climate is playing it out. So it's moved beyond oh yes, we agree with it or we don't agree with it, to being the lived reality of many, many people in the region. So it's moved to another place. So that's what I saw. And I quite like it that the community can get to see that if these people are elected onto the crossbench, there will be some topics that are so predominantly important that they will go to bat on it.
I could be really mean and just say to each of the panel members, right, key seats, are they going to get up? Because I'm curious to know what you will think about how the independents broadly stand. And bugger it, I think I'll do it anyway. Andrea, okay, Cathy, do you think that Helen Haines will get up and indict?
I declare a conflict of interest here. I lived in Helen Haines's house for 6 months at one stage. No, I don't know her though. She was off doing an exchange and we were working in Wangaratta for 6 months and her house happened to come up. I would think there's been obviously a really strong legacy that's been left there with Kathy. I've got lots of friends up in the region who are nurses and are very engaged with the politics. I think it's going to be a close one. I'd rather, you gave me an electorate like...
Okay, Susan Lee.
Oh,
Farah.
can't you ask me Tony Abbott's seat? Or...
Okay. Look, I'm so kind. What Zali Steggall?
Yeah, so I'm prepared to say I think Tony Abbott will lose his seat there.
Well,
Hey, I could be wrong, but...
will Phelps hold on to Wentworth?
Oh, we were having this conversation before.
I don't think so.
No.
Yeah, Karen doesn't think so. I just wonder whether Australians are a little more generous. She only just got the seat on a by-election. I know it's a Liberal stronghold and there was a strong protest vote about the way Malcolm Turnbull was treated as Prime Minister, but she's a pretty impressive candidate. And that's a fairly sophisticated electorate and it's the same contest that's going up. It came down to the wire last time on the by-election. And by-elections are a little anomalous. They're not really how it normally tracks. So, I don't know, you could toss a coin on that one.
Now, Karen, you're a no to that one, aren't you?
Yeah, I initially assumed that she would get back because mostly the theory goes that once an independent wins a seat, it's very hard to get them out of it. But it's a reasonably persuasive argument from people inside the process has been put to me that that's a particularly unusual set of circumstances, and that it may be the case that the protest about Malcolm Turnbull has been made, and that was a very large part of what happened in the by-election, and that in the end the voters in Wentworth are Liberals, and they believe in liberal values. They're probably largely progressive Liberals, but they are Liberals, and Karen hasn't been there in Parliament for a very long time, so she hasn't had a chance to do an enormous amount, but what she's focused on is refugees, and while they would care about that, that would not be the top priority, and that perhaps she hasn't talked enough about the economy and other things. Now, I'm not in Wentworth on the ground, so maybe she has, I don't know, and I could be proven quite wrong, but it's quite a persuasive argument, and if you look at the betting markets, which at this point in the campaign you actually can do, at the very beginning there you can't really tell what money's in the market anyway, but they are a reasonable indicator, and the parties look at them to see how seats are going, and Dave Sharma is ahead of, the odds are shorter on Dave Sharma in Wentworth, and that is another thing that makes me interested.
How's the betting going in Indo?
It's seesawing. I haven't had a look for a few days, but it has literally going back and forth. Initially, I think Helen Haynes was behind in terms of the odds, and then the other day she was in front, and so it literally is going up and down. And look at, things will happen between now and election day that will affect the way people vote. So
if they haven't voted already, which of course...
If they have, and that's another interesting factor, such a high pre-poll vote tends to, it obviously says people have made up their minds, and when they've made up their minds often, it is in favour of change. It's not always that, but often if there's a large number of people going out to do that, then I think the Labor Party would say that they were feeling good about the fact that there'd been people going early.
Nasha, do you have a sense of how well independents might do in this election? And there's some interesting commentary from the ABC's Anthony Green, who made the point that if you look at past history, independents have tended to affect a coalition vote, a Conservative vote, and if the polls are right, that the Conservatives are on the way out, then they're unlikely to impact on Labor's rise.
So particularly with Indo, I'm not familiar with, but I do have one student, a very good student actually, who lives and works in the seat, and speaking to him, certainly, young people there are happy with an independent MP. So
They might be one of the 1,600 volunteers.
Exactly. But I'm in Adam Bant's electorate, and certainly among us terrible latte-sipping, lefties, there is a sense of there's not that much difference between the major parties. So, I don't think I'd be able to make a call one way or the other in terms of
And of course,
the
Bant's
independence.
electorate is right next door to the old Melbourne ports, which is
Yes.
a really interesting competition this time round, isn't it?
It's the two electorates that I'm most familiar with in terms of my students covering these stories are Cooper and Latrobe, and they're both, they're both marginal. What I found really interesting, given some of the things that Kathy has been showing us, a couple of my students followed up on a similar scare tactic that the coalition did in La Trobe right after the state election. So they put out pamphlets that's with these dark hooded figures saying, "Are you safe enough in your electorate?" You know. So my students went out there and they asked people in that electorate, and they said, "Look, crime is an issue, but not like this," you know. So they were a little bit, I guess, turned off by that notion of by that fear mongering, which was, I know I think it'll definitely be an election where these seats where you see a lot of independent, smaller parties sort of putting up seats. The Animal Justice Party and the Victorian Socialists are running candidates in Cooper, where La Trobe University is located. I think there's a chance here for more of a voice from people who are not from the two major parties, because I guess that narrative, for better or worse, is that there's not that much of a difference between the two major parties.
We talked before about where the parties are putting their money and about Clive Palmer and his text, but that was one of the really surprising things about that news poll that came out at the beginning of the week. Well, it's surprising for me, maybe not for anyone else. 5%. For Clive Palmer. I mean, what do we make of that?
I don't think it's that surprising. It's perhaps disappointing because it says that money buys votes. Because I reckon we're all really sick of his ads. Maybe I'm speaking out of turn, but he's been bombarding everyone with ads. The One Nation vote has fallen in the wake of the Al Jazeera documentary about guns. I think there are a lot of issues that wouldn't necessarily sway One Nation voters, but there'll be some people who might be inclined to One Nation who really don't want the gun laws to change. And that does seem to have had an impact, whether it's just that or whether it's the sort of general chaos we've seen with the churn in One Nation and people leaving the party and being independent and Fraser Anning and all that stuff. But their vote has dropped. But there still is this section of the community that really doesn't want to vote for the major parties and is looking for somewhere else. And if they're not inclined to vote to the left, to Green, then they're looking for a conservative option, and that's where Clive comes in. And he is, I think, going to be in quite a pivotal position, which is why we've seen these preferences deals, because in some of those seats...
But is that not dangerous? Because it takes away the Conservative vote, and what was the estimate that only 60% will come back?
Yeah, so I was looking at the Queensland state election recently, and those central Queensland Adani seats, because there were some interesting contests there between the LNP, One Nation and Labor, and different. It ended up with sort of different combinations in several of those seats. And I think the preference flow from One Nation voters back to the coalition was between 60 and 75, pretty consistently. But the suggestion is that if you split that Conservative vote and you have Clive Palmer, whether it's not clear whether people who are voting for Clive Palmer will as studiously follow a how to vote card, because as you know, the only person who controls your preferences is you as a voter, but a lot of people will follow the how to vote card and copy it, and that's what the coalition will be hoping with this preference deal, that if they've reached an agreement with Palmer, that Palmer puts them second and they put Palmer second, that they will hope that Palmer's votes are the ones that get distributed because he can't reach a majority, and so that they'll get distributed to the coalition. And in some seats, that could make a big difference. He is running candidates in all House of Representatives seats. So
I wonder how his due diligence goes on all his candidates.
It's very poor. It's very poor. But those preferences will have an impact in some seats, and so that's the calculation that's been made. That even if it might really annoy some people that they've made this decision, it might be useful in little tiny, pockets where it
just
counts.
let me say in Indi, the preferences, Libs have preferenced Nats, have preferenced Clive, they've pressed then the Justice Party and put me in as number 5. So that's not going to... There's not going to be a lot of people who follow that.
Another thing about Clive that people should also know, that a lot of people don't know, is that Clive Palmer holds leases in the Galilee Basin, right next door to Adani's lease. So Clive Palmer has a personal direct business interest in what happens in the Galilee Basin. Gina Reinhardt's company holds leases there too, but they've all stood back and let the attention go on Adani. Clive is, in my experience, is mostly about Clive. And I think if the UAP gets back in a pivotal position, Clive will be interested in his own personal business interests.
I'm going to open this to the floor for questions in just a minute, but you just wanted to make a comment, Andrea, about Clive?
A couple of points. Clive Palmer last contested in 2013, where he got, as a party, they got 5.5% of the vote. They've had a name change since then. So it's not surprising that with him throwing so much money, 30 million in at ads, that he's starting to get some traction, and also has always understood how the media works, and so gets much more airplay than what he should get in proportion to his vote share. The other thing is the point that Karen made. It's a long-term trend now that Australians are moving away from the two major parties towards minor parties and independent candidates. 1 in 4 at the last election put their vote away from the major parties. But it was a bit of a special circumstance at the last election, being a double dissolution, which did halve the quota for the upper house. But that has been a trend that's been sitting there for some time. And I had another point, but I've forgotten it.
You can bring it up in a minute. Okay, we've got questions from the floor. We've got a couple of roving microphones. We've got a question down here. No comments, please.
You mentioned truth in advertising, but it seems that some of our politicians actually have a problem with reality itself. A former Prime Minister suggesting that the laws of mathematics don't apply was a Python-esque example. More worryingly, our Prime Minister suggesting that we're going to meet our Paris targets at a canter. Is that what the department's advising him, or is he lying to the electorate, to Australia? Is that acceptable, and can we do anything about it?
Come on in, spinner. So the last piece of private members' legislation that I put up to the House was for an ICAC, a National Integrity Commission, to check all that out. It didn't get through, but it did bring the Attorney General, Christian Porter. He came in with, about prep, if ours is about grade 6, to say that he would start that work. But this country definitely, like of all the things we need, is some form of national integrity effective body, a bit like what we've got with the IBAC in Victoria. So that's needed. But closely aligned with it, with the second part of our private members bill, was a code of conduct for politicians. Thank you, would be really useful. It doesn't exist.
But that's been tried before and no one wanted to sign it.
Well, actually not quite true. In the hung parliament of 2010, the House of Reps passed a code of conduct, a process for getting a code of conduct.
Don't we have a bonk ban?
But it didn't get to it didn't get to the Senate.
I thought about mentioning that, but then I decided
No.
no.
So it's actually gone through the whole process, but the Senate didn't actually agree to it, so it's there. And the bonk ban, while you laugh about it, is only for ministers.
And only for their own staff.
So it doesn't
they
actually
can bonk someone else's staff.
So
and hope they don't change staff.
That's when it gets very complicated.
Exactly what you say. The people of Australia cannot have confidence that there's a mechanism, like we have in Victoria, that where you have got serious worries about exactly what you're talking about, there is a process for us to check it out. We don't have it.
But that's sort of what you're talking about, basically, is working out whether something is fact or fiction. And lying is, I don't know if you saw Amanda Vanstone last night on You Can't Ask That on the ABC. She was specifically asked, do politicians lie? And she said, well, some might, but I never did. You don't always tell the whole truth. But is that lying? And politicians are very adept at providing the information they wish to provide.
She did used to impersonate one of her advisors and answer her own phone and pretend she was someone else in her office,
No one put that to her.
No.
Okay, we've got a question here from the gentleman in the back, and then I'll move over the other side.
Thank you. Can I ask you to look again at the question of the engagement of the electorate, particularly the young people post same-sex marriage? Contrary to what you said, it's not compulsory to vote. It's only compulsory to turn up and have your name marked off. Do you think there'll be a big non-turn-up to vote, and B, a big informal vote this year because of that?
Nasha, let me ask you that.
We did, sorry, I did allude to that. You'd get a fine, obviously, if you don't tick your name off. I think, as I said earlier, we really have no way of knowing whether or not this increased engagement leads to people turning up and drawing whatever they want on their ballot papers. So we joke about how, most of us are tempted to vote above the line because of the multitude of candidates, and we don't really think about but I have seen with my own eyes people voting in the Indonesian elections. They've got pages and pages, poster-sized ballot papers, 4 of them. And I've seen young people sitting there pulling up their phones and actually seeing, what does this candidate stand for? You know, and so I think that's pretty amazing. I don't know. I do kind of like the sort of the very lackadaisical sort of Australian sense of humour that our democracy is about sausages, you know, that our democracy is about, you know, taking the piss, you know, and very, very sort of that casual approach to it. But I honestly, I don't know whether that will translate, as you say, to people turning up and actually making an informed choice. Are they going to simply vote the way that their parents or their friends, you know, have been speaking about? Yeah, I really can't make a call on it.
Maybe I was going to say an idealist, maybe I'm a very cynical idealist, but maybe I am an idealist, but I feel like they will turn up and vote, and here's why, because the experience of that marriage debate was quite empowering to, it was a people power thing. The politicians wouldn't make a decision, so the public, even though they didn't like being asked to, they did make the decision. And I think a lot of people took from that, actually, we can take back the power if we do cast our vote when required. And so I suspect you will see a high turnout.
There was also not long afterwards the quite impressive turnout at the climate change rally.
Yeah.
Which was driven by young people.
And I do think that, which is the sort of dangerous flip side of having engaged in that process. You got people on the electoral rolls and you got them activated, and you got a sense that they can take back the power from their elected representatives and force change upon them from the ground. And so that's why I feel like there probably will be a reasonable turnout in terms of actually going and filling out the ballot papers.
I'm just curious, because I don't know the answer to this, but when the AEC puts out the numbers of informal votes, can they tell you which age bracket they were in? I guess they can't, can
No.
they? They can't tell you anything. They can't. All they can tell you is which areas
If
they were in.
we'd be very worried about that. Yeah.
Yes, that would not work. Yes, they would. That would be way too. But it could be helpful.
But
for questions like this.
Last election, there was a record level. The turnout was low. They turned up. There was a high informal vote, and one of the reasons for that, it was thought, was because there's been an experimentation in some states of automatically enrolling people onto the electoral roll through Centrelink records and linking up some of those other government agencies. And so some people may not have known that they were put onto the electoral system, or they might have known and rejected that and actively were against it. But to the point that Karen was making, some research we did on the same-sex marriage debate showed that the reason that ended up being a yes result was because the campaign mobilised the yes vote, which was largely younger people. And they did turn up. It was a voluntary postal vote, as we'll remember. It wasn't compulsory, and the turnout was exceptional. So
what you can know, to be serious for a second about the votes, is you can track. The political parties know who lives where, so you can look at what booths, which way particular booths vote, and you know that, booth A over here, the demographic living around that is a lot of young people, or a lot of older people, or people, in retirement homes or whatever.
So you can draw some.
You can draw some conclusions from that if everyone's voting where they live, which is not always the case, but mostly it is.
Another question over here.
Thank you. I'd just make a couple of points that I'll draw together as a question, if I may. Majority of Australia's population lives in big cities, whatever the number is, 75 going toward 80%. The balance obviously in regional areas. 60% of the Australian economy emanates from the cities, 40% from regional areas. So you've got a disproportionate amount of economic activity contributing to the Commonwealth or the nation's wealth coming from regional areas. My point is, how can we, if we're going to grow the number of potential regional independent members of Parliament, get a cohesive focus by them on the big picture, which is long-term? And if you look at climate change, it has some short-term elements, but it has many medium and long-term elements. And yet we're simply locked into a very short-termist perspective in politics generally, and have been for some decades now. So as a voter, I'm feeling quite despondent that because more independent candidates actually make the deal-making, the horse trading, far more complex. And often it is focused on their electorate, the outcomes, and you've done a great job, Kathy, in terms of eliminating black spots where I live, and I thank you for that. But the bigger picture is the country. And I'm having a debate with my own locals about shifting a bridge when the bigger issue is getting double stacking of freight trains going through in the national interest.
But let me put
So
that question to
how
Kathy,
can we
because I
fix
take
that
your point
longer-term
entirely. What do you think? I mean, how does this big local versus national balance itself out?
So when I first got elected, it really worried me about that because I made a commitment that I would put Indi first. But truly, it doesn't take you very long to actually understand that there's no thing in Australia called a regional Australia policy. And without a national policy, the poor old cities are stuck. So that became my number one piece of work, which we never got, we're still working with it. But anyhow, we need a national policy on the regions. And until we've actually got the policy level, so the work that I did was was around the nitty-gritty, of course, but then very quickly, as a Member of Parliament, you get your lawmaking job. We haven't got any if you go to the National Party, they don't have any policy on regional Australia, and the Libs and Nats don't have either. So without a policy, so very quickly you move into that role of a policy maker. And I know on the crossbench that was the work we constantly did, was how are we going to do the national work, because it plays out in the regions. So that was why we did the national integrity stuff, because we had all this gunk going on in our electorate and some really bad stuff happened, but we had nowhere we could go. So you move very, very quickly into that national role, and then you join your committee. And just another quick example, in my electorate, we're looking at Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander representation, and the Victorian government has done fantastic work on treaty, like we're running 1,000 miles ahead of it, and the Commonwealth hasn't. So I was on that inquiry, representing particularly the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander members of my community, but working in that national context of how does all this play out. So I came away with this just enormous respect for how our democracy works, that if you actually represent your grassroots community and you play in the 151 members of Parliament, it works. You bring your local interest in, and you take that responsibility of a lawmaker for the country. And I don't think there was a single Member of Parliament that didn't do that, that take the local stuff and make it national. We all did it, because the community calls you to it, but the Parliament itself calls you to be a policy maker for the nation.
And arguably that letter whatever you want to call it, the agreement that Helen Haines has signed with the 6 other independents is going to national issues. Another question, we've got a lady here in the...
This is very quick. I'm just interested, not my seat, but Frydenberg versus Burnside. What do you think?
Yates.
Yeah, what do you think?
I think Josh will win.
I live in the electorate, and the only person who's knocked on my door was a Frydenberg person.
I suspect that Josh will win, but he is very active. And people in Kooyong tell me there's a lot more engagement from the Liberal Party than usual. So it's certainly activated Josh. There's a lot of leaflets flying around. There's a lot of knocking on doors.
Billboards.
There's a lot of money. So I do think that the combination of Oliver Yates and Julian Burnside has pushed them to be at least engaging a lot more. It'd be interesting to see which of those two ends up ahead of the other one.
Burnside's an interesting one, isn't he?
Yes, I wonder whether whether the recruitment of Julian Burnside is as much to send a message to sort of potential Greens voters elsewhere. I live in the ACT, and I got a leaflet for the Greens featuring the photograph of Julian Burnside, who I knew who he was, but a lot of other people wouldn't. So that's interesting to me that he's not running anywhere near the ACT, but he was on their flyers. So they're sort of using him as the poster boy to attract the thinking potential Greens voter, presumably. Because
I grew up in that particular area, and as you say, Karen, even the fact that he is running, that there is a massive office for Julian Burnside on the corner of Auburn and Glenferrie Roads is pretty... I agree with you guys. I think Josh will sort of take home. But the fact that somebody like Julian Burnside is running in a seat that is... I don't think I'll offend anyone. It's insufferably middle class.
Thanks for that.
But the fact that Burnside is running there is, I think, I thought it was a huge shake-up. Just going home from my gym the other day, and it's like this massive, poster of Burnside.
It's like when I go home, I have to see two posters, one of Josh and the other of Burnside, and only one of them has been turned into Dracula, and it's Burnside, not Josh.
Yeah.
I was going to say, having said that, if there is a threat to Frydenberg from either of those two, I think the greatest threat is Oliver Yates, not Julian Burnside. Oliver Yates is a Liberal underneath.
But the skill is those two guys have divided the opposition vote.
Yep.
Yes.
So if anyone here from that electorate, if you want to see something serious happen, the Greens and those guys have got to come together and talk about their second preference. Because if a bit like what you were saying before about Wentworth, there was a very clever campaign in that by-election to make sure that the Greens and Labor supported Karen to get up, because they didn't want to divide the vote. And it's exactly the same in Josh's seat. If people got, and there's just so little understanding in our community about that, and again in our electorate it's the same thing, trying to get people to actually understand that it's their second, third and fourth preference that if I'm fifth if not me, Helen Haines is fifth on the Liberal Party how to vote card, then it's your fifth and sixth vote that you actually have to pay attention to. People find that incredibly difficult. So in our community, we've been running understand your preference workshops. So I'd be saying, if you really want to do something in these inner city ones, get your community to understand, and then the word of mouth, against social media, the word of mouth goes, actually, look who you put last. And people didn't actually understand that it was your last vote that's where you need to put your people. So anyhow, a call out to get your preferences right between Julian and Oliver, because that's what's going to make the difference there.
Well, and similarly in Flinders, I suspect if there is a
This is
threat...
Greg Hunt's seat, where Julia Banks is.
If there's a threat to Greg Hunt, it's not Julia Banks, it's Labor, because Labor is likely to run second, she's likely to run third, her preferences will be distributed, and I suspect, you know Julia better than I, but I know her reasonably well, I suspect her preferences, she'll be recommending her preferences flow to Labor before...
She's already said that, I think.
Yeah, before the Liberal Party. So that's why that whole thing about, as Kathy says, who ends up where is important, because it's the Stephen Bradbury candidate in the middle who comes through the middle often in a very tight race.
Yeah. Another question? Down here.
Poor Stephen Bradbury. He won a gold medal.
Yes, exactly.
And forever.
Exactly.
We
Who cares
somehow
how?
diminished that. I take responsibility for that and apologise.
I would just like to bring us to what I think is a far more fundamental point than the issues that you've been talking about, and that is this idea that there is no difference between the parties. The thing about any election, of course, the most simple thing is it's who gets to be the government and what they do in government.
Sure.
And to me, we have now reached a point here in Australia where, in relation to our friends in America and Great Britain, we're on the cusp of either falling into the trap that they've both fallen in with the two elections that got Brexit and Trump, where clearly the thing that actually influences a hell of a lot of people is propaganda that's brought out either through dirty stuff on Facebook or the Herald Sun in Australia and the Murdoch newspapers in Australia, who build up a whole, as you know, build up over the whole period between the elections, a whole set of ideas.
So what's your question? How do we
my
avoid
question
that?
is, wouldn't it be more important for us to look at how our democracy is not working and hope that in this election we can make it a contest of the two different sets of ideas, and so set our future along one set of ideas rather than another?
So I'll take that one to start with. So that's exactly what we're trying to do in Indi. The major parties weren't working for us. It's never been a context of ideas. It's a context of it's a context of pork barrelling and stuff where you don't even want for your country. So by this really concerted activity of engaging with young people, in building confidence, in showing that democracy is actually a good system and it works, but you need to be engaged.
But how do you get that past Indi? How do you get that?
Hopefully, I can't speak for Melbourne and Sydney, and I know the economic power they've got, but it's definitely working in the country. And that's what's happening. People are going. So that's what we will continue to do. You know, give us 10 years and we might have much better I don't think we're going to change the Nats. They've got a long way before they're going to do it, but we will have more independents running in the country because they can do it. But that's one thing. But the second thing is I just want to point out something about gender, which we haven't talked about tonight. But when I first got elected in 2013, it was me, the only woman on the crossbench ever, Clive Palmer, Andrew Wilkie and Adam Bann. Bob Catter. Like an eclectic group of people, let me say. 2016, Rebecca Sharkey came in. Really clever, public policy, fantastic representative. And then before we had 4 women on that crossbench. And that iconic photo that went around the nation of 4 really intelligent, clever, strong, courageous women on the crossbench did, I think, more for the confidence of people than I have almost any seen from the major party. So there was something magic about people going, you're a bit older, you're a bit wiser, except for Rebecca, she's a bit younger, but she's a mother, she's been through life, we can really trust her. So I think people get that you just have to have more gender diversity, you have to have more racial diversity, you have to have more age diversity. The parties, Labor, I would acknowledge, is doing a really good job on it, but the Conservatives aren't. But until you actually get that, and if you have to get it on the crossbench and you have to get it from the regions, well, let's do that. Because we've just got to keep the National Party being as bloody hopeless as they are, and we'll be able to, hopefully, the movement that I'm part of, which was we're all talking to each other around the country. You just had to watch the reaction. Let me just go back to the Barnaby affair, the horrible stuff that came out of him. And the thought that he might actually be the leader of the National Party, which was last year, whoa. So the women all got organised and said, we are not going to have that. So I put a huge amount of trust in rural and regional women and the city independent women to stand up. And I just have been so proud to be there with Julia Banks, the courage she's played, and with Karen and with Rebecca. And we might go, but we're not going to go. We will just get organised to do the next wave and the next wave until we've actually got the values and the integrity that we want for the country and drag those parties into that place.
We're almost out of time, but let me ask the panel about diversity and whether or not we are making progress on that front, and particularly after the events of the past year. Karen?
Well, yes, slow progress. I was going to go back and answer that question, actually. But
well, you go if you like.
I was just going to say, I actually do think there's a choice this time. I actually do think there's more of a choice this time than there used to be, that the programs are... The programs are quite different. I think what is common between, if we're talking about the major parties, is that they still keep changing their leaders at their own whim for their own reasons, and I don't think anyone's quite convinced that that's washed its way through yet. But until it does, there will be this level of disillusionment with our system, and I think that's the great danger, that it's done great damage to the nature of our democracy, and we've got a wave of young people coming through who've been set a very poor example in terms of Australia's democracy. So it'd be really nice if we got back to just a policy debate and looked at people's policy programs and didn't focus on the stuff in the letterbox and the rubbish on social media and stuff.
But part of that is more women.
And that's where that is connected, that yes, I do think we are making progress. I think it's been disappointing to see on the Liberal side the sorts of things that have happened in the context of that power struggle last year. That's what brought all this to a head, the behaviour, the standover behaviour of some people in engaging in that process, some in Parliament and some outside. And if you look at Labor, for all the arguments against quotas and that sort of thing, it has actually got them to a critical mass where the tone of their debate... People don't get away with what they used to get away with, even with the factions still as volatile as they ever were. They don't get away with the nature of behaviour that used to occur, I think.
And we've literally got 1 or 2 minutes left. Andrea, do you want to...
I'll keep it short. I think we can learn from the States and maybe go to 4-year terms rather than 3. Because when you put a bit of leadership churn in there as well, you end up with policy moving on very short term, changing when the leader changes, and 3 years is not very long to be able to set a longer term agenda. And I think the Liberal Party will have to look at quotas, even if they taken kicking and screaming to them, because since 1999, women as as a whole have been voting more progressive than they have Liberal, which they were doing before 1999, and it's at their peril if they ignore 50.7% of the population.
The Liberals used to have really good women's
Yes.
representation,
Yeah.
and
It's gone down.
slipped.
It peaked under John Howard, which was 20 years ago, which tells us something.
Yeah.
So just
Sorry.
on diversity, very, very quickly, we are making progress. Unfortunately, women and women of colour, when they do get involved in politics, they're subject to much harsher treatment from the media and from in many cases by constituents. So I can point to Anne Ali, Mehreen Faruqi over in New South Wales, and that reflects things that happen in the United States as well with the Somalian American senator Ilhan Omar.
So that is a subject for an entire other bold thinking series session. Before I let you go, really quickly, I mean, it's literally a one-word answer. Andrea, who will win?
No.
Labor, 7 seats.
Oh, goodness. I'm not going to be that specific. I still think that Labor will probably win, yeah.
Kathy?
I've got no idea.
Well, but Helen will get up?
I don't know. It depends what. It's not that. We're not there yet. No, I don't. It's going to be very close in India. It'll come down to preferences, and it's harvesting all those second preferences, and it's really difficult. So
Yeah, well,
I'm not confident at all.
And the caveat on what I said is we've got 2 weeks to go, and however many
Anything could
million people
happen.
have to actually cast their vote, and
God
they
knows
get
what
to
they'll
choose.
find on social media in 2 weeks' time. Nasha?
Labor, but by a tiny margin.
Okay. Please join me in thanking our really impressive panel very much, Nasha and Kathy and Karen. Thank you. I just want to let you know the Bold Thinking series will be back on the 13th of June. Complete change of pace. How dogs can help war veterans overcome PTSD. Maybe a few politicians could be put in there as well after the election. We'll be hearing from Professor Pauline Bennett, Dr. Tiffany Howe, veteran Kelly Dodds, dog trainer Kevin Picker, and an animal welfare scientist, Mia Cobb. So look for that on June the 13th. Thank you all very much for coming and for joining the conversation so well. Thank you.
Thank you too.
Thank you, Dali.
Yeah.